Anyway, thanks for being here and for coming to this little time. And don't worry, we'll finish on time so we can have evening prayer because they'll start coming in. And also because I have a vestry meeting tonight, so I've got to get to vestry. So my name is Joshua Castaño, and I'm a vestryman at St. Mark's, Philadelphia, which is actually a church on the it's a National Historic Landmark, which is the highest level of designation for historic properties in the United States. It was built in 1846, so we're coming up on our 175th anniversary, and it's a pretty remarkable place in terms of history and art and worship. It was one of the earliest parishes in the United States to celebrate a weekly Eucharist on Sunday mornings as the principal service, beginning in the 19th century, and also beginning in the 19th century, celebrating daily Eucharistic services, in addition to those on the major feasts of the church. So it was a church founded in the Anglo-Catholic tradition, so as a result of the Oxford movement. In fact, it's one of the very earliest and few churches in the United States that was built with the advice and the guidance of the Cambridge Ecclesiological Society, so the ecclesiologists, who were a group of mostly clergy and some laity in England who were promoting a renewal of architecture, art, and liturgy to be in parallel and in concert with the theological efforts of the Oxford movement itself as a renewal movement within the life of the Anglican Church. So that's where my spirituality is housed. I'm also a senior program manager at an organization called Partners for Sacred Places. It's a national nonprofit. It's a secular nonprofit, actually, that gives us the freedom to work with everyone, and also to gather funding from beyond the church and faith community. Partners was founded in 1989 in Philadelphia. We have offices in Chicago and Texas. Our work is pretty broad. I'll describe that a little bit later. We do a lot of different things. But our mission has been and continues to be to support communities and congregations as they work to preserve historic houses of worship and maximize their value and use to the community and to those around them. So our work, it sort of came out of preservation, but has expanded much more beyond that into a lot of different areas. I just wanted to start with this, and so I don't have this sort of set up as I'm going to talk and then there's necessarily questions. There's a couple of points where I just want to ask questions and maybe have a little bit of discussion, and that'll be kind of the rhythm of this. Are we all okay with that? Is that all right? So I just wanted to start with this. Obviously, as Anglicans, you've probably heard George Herbert. Your rectors have probably all quoted George Herbert at some point in your time. But I love this poem, and of course, you know, being a Rite One aficionado, I had to go with the old spelling here, which is probably off-putting, but I like this old spelling. So, mark you the floor, that square and speckled stone, which looks so firm and strong, is patience, and the other black and grave, wherewith each one is checkered all along, humility. The gentle rising, which on either hand leads to the choir above, is confidence. But the sweet cement, which in one sure band ties the whole frame, is love and charity. Hither sometimes sin steals and stains the marble's neat and curious veins, but all is cleansed when the marble weeps. Sometimes death, puffing at the door, blows all the dust about the floor, but while he thinks to spoil the room, he sweeps. Blessed be the architect whose art could build so strong in a weak heart. Of course, George Herbert was a great Anglican divine who mostly did his ministry as a little church rector in a small town that most people would forget. This poem I always like is a wonderful way to begin with some inspiration. Obviously, the checkered floor, the choir above, the cement, the marble. He has this wonderful way of talking about church buildings in a way that allows their symbolism to speak and have life and to open up a way of understanding our pilgrim way as Christians and as people who are being drawn always closer towards Christ. I'm not going to make today a defense of maybe, let's say, Oxford movement principles around sacred places, but I will say, as we kind of start out, that what we've inherited, especially as Anglicans and Episcopalians, is one of the richest heritages of art and architecture that have been consecrated to divine purposes and have been used to educate, to uplift, to inspire, and to support the life of Christians individually and community as they make their lifelong way as pilgrims towards Christ and towards the purposes that God has called them to. So, reminding ourselves that it's not just about let's say the dichotomy between buildings and between spirituality is maybe one that we've created more so in the 20th century than existed for a few centuries before that. Maybe there is a little bit more wisdom or a different kind of wisdom that allowed us to see an integrated experience of spiritual life as disciples of Christ, where we didn't have to put buildings or art or liturgy as opposed to some kind of other spiritual purpose. And we can talk more about that. But I wanted to also remind, by the way, this is what was supposed to be sort of a baptistry type room. It's a Spanish Gothic revival room at St. John the Divine in New York City. I wanted to point out a really interesting little article that came out. It was in all the Anglican newswires earlier this summer, and kind of popped up and then disappeared again. And it was an article, if you just Google, church buildings influential in forming young people's faith. It was research done in the UK by an organization focused on kind of youth spiritual formation. This is the quote I want to read. "The influence of a church building was more significant than attending a youth group, going to a wedding, or speaking to other Christians about their faith. Jimmy Dale, the Church of England's National Youth Evangelism Officer, said his team had been shocked by the results." What the research there is pointing out was that actually for young people who call themselves Christians and identified as Christians in the UK, the experience of walking into a church building and experiencing a church building was more significant statistically in this research than those other examples I just counted. When we have a tradition of buildings that speak, right, that actually speak to us, and we have people who are spiritually wise, who understand that and can elucidate that for us and help us engage with it, we actually come up with a really wonderful tool for spiritual formation and for ministry, one that's always speaking. And here, you could spend hours here in this building, just in this building, learning about what it means to be a disciple just by using our eyes and looking at things and talking about them with other Christians. And that's not something to be made light of. What we have inherited in our sacred places, especially in the strong kind of tradition of the Episcopal and Anglican tradition after the 19th century, is that these places are meant to outwardly be an outward sign of an inward and spiritual grace, right? An outward sign of a spiritual orientation towards Christ and towards movement towards Christ, right? So why is that historic font in the back? Now, a lot of people here are going to know why, right? The font is in the back because there is an understanding that symbolically, now of course, in the 18th century, everybody wanted the font in the front so you can see what's happening, right? But there is this sense of putting the font back to the back of the church because the font is wherein we enter the church. Remember the baptismal liturgy in the Book of Common Prayer, you are dead with Christ and you are made alive again with Christ, right? So we die and are born again through the water of baptism. It is literally our entry into the church. So that's why it's in the back. The altar is the end point. Why is the altar the end point? Because the altar, the sacrifice of Christ, the living Christ who has offered himself in sacrifice and is now alive, is the end point of it all. It's the beginning and the end. So these buildings can help shape a deep pattern of spiritual engagement and life for us. They can reflect our mission, our theology, and our discipleship. And I just want you to kind of think about that a little bit. Do anybody have any questions about that or anything they want to mention? Okay. I'll give you 3 seconds. I was always told by my mentors to actually let the room drop for a second so everybody can actually be brave enough to answer their questions. I mentioned the organization that I work for. So this talk is a little bit, I'm wearing 2 hats, and I'm trying to put them both on at the same time and see which ones stay on. So I want to talk actually not about theology the rest of this hour. Well, not directly, and not about necessarily an obvious way of spiritual practice, but actually about how our buildings are our biggest tools for ministry and discipleship, and how they're tools for that. I mentioned a little bit about who our organization is. You can forgive Reverend Nancy Muth. She is a Presbyterian minister, but that's probably okay. We work with a lot of people in a lot of different denominations. But she's someone who put it as simply as this years ago for us, and it's been a really important part of what we do. Your building is your greatest physical tool or asset for ministry. We may like to think that we will escape our buildings and be able to flourish without them. That, in reality, is usually almost never the case. Buildings are really important, and they're really important for ministry in concrete ways and also in symbolic and spiritual ways. They're really important, and they're really our biggest tool for ministry. So we've been caught pretty often, though, in a way of thinking about our sacred places that is driven by a cycle of scarcity. Well, we don't have enough money for ministry, so we don't have enough money to fix the roof. So the roof is going to leak because we know that people are going to really want to get engaged with ministry here when half the plaster is falling down on the south aisle of the church, and when half the Sunday school rooms in the basement are so full of mold and damp that we don't use them anymore, and the gym goes unused most of the week. The example I'm trying to give here, the picture I'm trying to paint, is drawn from my real-life work with congregations across the country. And it's that we have assets that go underutilized, buildings that sit silent most of the week when they could be activated and used for ministry and for people. And we have a sense that we have shrinking resources, and our resources can certainly not go to fixing up a building, because Jesus would be very disappointed with us if we put a new roof on this church. And that's really what I would call a cycle of scarcity mentality. So we're driven by thinking we have smaller resources, and then we have smaller resources, and we have smaller resources, and it really begats nothing. Nothing begats nothing. It doesn't come from nothing. And it reminds me actually of the story of the talents. And I'm not going to tell it because there's a lot of clergy in the room today, and I always mess up some of the details. But you can look it up in the Bible, and I wish Merrick was here because you probably know the chapter and verse. I don't, because I'm an Anglo-Catholic, so I don't know the chapter and verse. But the thing I love about that story is that God, the master, let's say the master is identified with God, but the master is not rewarding someone being fearful and taking what little resources they have and not using them. What's being rewarded is taking the risk to take what resources we have and see if we might allow them to flourish and be abundant with God's grace. So what I like to think about as a much more scriptural or Christian way of understanding what we have is a cycle of abundance. If we actually take the risk to use what we have and to invest in it, we might actually engender growth. We might actually support vitality. We might actually see the fruitfulness of God's grace in more lives than we had previously. And it is a gamble, and it is a risk when we seem to have so few resources to work with. A while ago, Partners was working with a number of churches across the country, and we said nobody really cared about old historic churches. Dioceses and conferences and bishops and all the judicatories across the main line wanted to pretty much get rid of buildings if they could. Churches were facing smaller memberships and less resources and didn't know what to do either. And the general public didn't think much about truthfully, didn't have always a very positive view mainline churches, especially old mainline churches, a lot of times in cities and towns across the country. And so one of the things we discovered, though, was, wow, a lot of these churches are homes to so many activities, events, programs, ministries, much of which not even connected directly to the church, throughout the week. But nobody really knows this. The church doesn't articulate it, and the outside world doesn't know about it either. So this report, Sacred Places at Risk, which was actually a big, huge national research project, happened with partners at University of Pennsylvania. And it looked at over 100 churches to say what's happening there every week, and can we actually come up with what the economic value is of some of these of this activity. This is the graph that I like the most from that study. So you see this pie graph, and there's only two pie chart. There's only two pieces of this pie, right? There's this big piece that says 81%, right? Can anyone read what it says there? Non-members, right? On the average week for the churches in the study, so this is the average, right? This is the average. 81% of the human beings that walked through the door every week were not members of that church. 81%. Only 19% were members. 93% of the congregations open their doors to the community. Congregations host about 76% of their community service-oriented programs in their own buildings. And congregations leverage the average, which is now actually larger than this, and I'll get to that in a second, 5,300 hours of volunteer service a year. Are you telling that story? Do you even know how many volunteer hours you catalyze in your own congregations each year? It's a lot. Really powerful for making your message to a wider group of people. And in this old research, the annual economic value that congregations are providing was $140,000 each. I tell you, that has changed dramatically. So within the last 5 years, we decided to update the research. We went back to our research partners at University of Pennsylvania and said, we need to improve the methodology, we need to improve the scope of this. And I have a copy of this, and we came up with this thing called the economic halo effect of historic sacred places. There are 90 congregations in study across the country. The average value for each congregation was $1.7 million. So some of these are very small churches. Some are very big, some are very small. The average, though, was $1.7 million worth of value in their community. Now, the new I have a couple of copies of the new Halo report, and I don't have a slide for it, but I want to show that on page 13, there's another great little graph, and it's all these little blue people and some red people. The blue people represent non-members. So remember, it was 81%? It's actually now 87%. So the most recent data has actually just upped everything. The average number of volunteer hours is actually now closer to 5,700. So sacred places matter in a lot of different ways and in a lot of different kinds of activity and in different ways that we can talk about that value to those who are not engaged with our congregations directly, who might care to hear about this. 87%. So here's the big question. Why should we invest in our historic sacred places when there is so much need in the world? Does anybody have an answer? That's right. And is that building actually helping alleviate some of that need in the world? We have actually, in many places, inherited a lot of facilities that reflect a particular moment in mainline Christianity in the Episcopal Church called the institutional church movement. It was this idea that the nice little Episcopal parish, where all the fine people in town come to worship on Sunday morning, is actually meant to be something much bigger than that. So this great period of time from the 1880s through the early 20th century, in some places up to the Second World War, there was this investment in lots of buildings that had not just a beautiful church, but a chapel and a gym and locker rooms and a kitchen and maybe 2 kitchens and maybe classrooms and maybe offices and maybe larger spaces. Why? Because the institutional church movement was the idea that the church was called to be the center of life and community wherever it found itself. That a whole range of activity, everything was going to happen in that building. It was not just worship on Sunday mornings. It was not just daily worship. It was a whole host of activities that would happen in that building. The basketball team, I mean, I literally grew up with the last vestiges of this, I remember, in the town that I lived in, where there were still church basketball teams. I mean, there was a really bigger sense of the church's place in the world. And so there was huge investment, generous, faithful Christians who invested hard-earned resources of theirs into this vision of the church's place in community as drawing to itself a wider group of people from just outside the Sunday worshipers and making an impact on the lives of more than just Sunday worshipers and members, but actually pulling the world towards the church and towards Christ by making it able to reach out to people in a number of different ways. I just think that that's a really important context for us to remember about why we have so many, why we have such a blessing in terms of facilities. It's not always easy to see it as a facilities. I mean, how many of your churches here have kitchens? How many have gyms or large fellowship halls? How many have more than 3 or 4 classrooms? Okay, so you keep asking these questions. Now, how many of your churches would you say 75% of the space is used every day of the week? 50% of the space? 25% of the space? Okay. So there's a lot of real estate there that's not being used, right? During the week. Okay. Could that be space for making disciples? That's kind of my question to you. I gave it away. That's part of what today is about. I just want to talk, these are some examples from the region and from the country of churches that really found a new path for themselves, partly because of what was happening to their buildings. So, and they're not all Episcopalian, but that's okay. They have their own, second-class studios in the Heavenly Hotel, but that's all right. We still love them. So Calvary United Methodist in West Philadelphia, fantastic, amazing Victorian building. Their average Sunday attendance was below 50 in the early 1990s. They put the building on the market, and it wouldn't sell for 2 years. It didn't sell for 2 years. They have some of the best Tiffany stained glass in this entire region. So a really big collector, Dree House, who has a foundation out in Chicago, bought their windows, and the glass was about to go to Chicago, or actually to Florida, where he hoards all of it. And the community found out, and they said, you can't do this. This is a kind of changing neighborhood, changing in terms of gentrification was just around the corner and just outside the core of where the universities are in West Philadelphia. The community said, no, you can't do that to us. And I said, well, where have you guys been? I mean, there's we're about to close up shop. We've got to sell this place, and nobody's been buying, so we're just going to sell off the pieces until who knows what. Well, they did something pretty radical. They actually partnered with the community to do this thing they called the Calvary Center for Culture and Community. And, not going to get into all the legal stuff of it because it changes in each denomination around property, but actually this nonprofit, which is a secular nonprofit, although the church has a controlling interest in it, manages the entire building. The church actually releases its space back from them. The church moved out of the sanctuary into the chapel, and this building became basically the de facto community center for that entire neighborhood in Philadelphia. I can't tell you, every time I go past that place, people in and out every day and through the evening. They ended up actually incubating 5 congregations worship there on Sundays. They helped incubate the first new synagogue in Philadelphia in 100 years, and another congregation, so it's got this sort of interfaith flavor there too as well. But it has become a really, really incredible center for vitality and for community there in West Philadelphia. It took a lot of bravery to do what they did. The other interesting thing is, almost 20 years ago now, they were below 50 in terms of who showed up on Sunday mornings. They're now solidly over 100, which doesn't sound like a huge jump, right? But for a lot of congregations, actually that kind of growth is pretty tremendous. And to say a congregation that was ready to go out of business, sell off its assets, and close up its doors, now has a pretty solid Sunday morning attendance and active membership, and has had a whole new lease on its life. Is kind of an amazing story, I think. It looks different for everybody else. St. Paul's in Syracuse is a church that I worked with that is right downtown. It's a massive Victorian Gothic building, pretty wonderful heritage to it. It had been the cathedral for the Diocese of Central New York twice. It's not the cathedral, then it was the cathedral, it was not the cathedral, then it was cathedral. In its last incarnation, it was the cathedral, and it has a 10,000 square foot parish house. 10,000 or is it 12,000? 10,000 square foot parish house, which the diocese was using the majority of. The diocese decided to move out to the suburbs. I don't know who moves out to the suburbs in the 2000s, but in terms of institutional life, but they decided to move out to the suburbs, leaving this massive church in the middle of downtown Syracuse with 10,000 square feet of empty real estate. Also, they had incubated a number of really amazing ministries, one dealing with immigrants and refugees, and they have a history of welcoming immigrants and refugees, and another dealing with serving those who are experiencing homelessness. Both had been incubated to the point where they'd grown so much they needed bigger accommodations and needed their own space. So they had done a really good thing that had left them now, years later, they kind of have an empty space again. And so they didn't know what to do. At the same time, the community around them is also beginning to change and is experiencing a lot of investment. Commercial housing, new retail, co-working spaces, new restaurants, new coffee shops, basically a huge change in downtown living and life, and a huge focus at the city planning level on this. So they said, what can we do? We worked with them, and we actually pulled together a group of community leaders from all the major civic institutions, from government, from real estate, from architecture and community planning and design and real estate development, the local largest employers, which were hospitals and academic, the university in Syracuse, brought them all those leaders together on behalf of the church to help the church figure out what to do. How many churches have ever thought about going to community leaders and saying, we want to use our building better for the community, can you help us? It's a thing that a lot of people haven't thought about before. So they brought these community leaders together. They did some planning exercises with a wide group of stakeholders who are interested in what the future of downtown looks like. And it's because they went to them and said, we're here, we're a huge asset, historically, in terms of what we do for people, who we are as a faith community, and we want to do that better with the assets that we have. So they supported them in this really tremendous way. They now have plans and a whole vision for basically continuing to support many of the ministries they have, homelessness and work with immigrants and refugees, but also adapting to the changing neighborhood that they see it. They're actually mentioned in a Living Church article about how they got Google 360 to come in and actually do the interior of the church. Has anybody even thought about that kind of a thing? I can send you the link. It was a really neat article. They were also on the local NPR affiliate there, documenting their experience of kind of facing this huge challenge and coming up with a way that it actually would reflect their mission as a congregation and their vision for their future as an anchor institution in downtown Syracuse. That was a faith community that was going to be vital and was going to be a major community partner, which was a pretty brave and noble effort on their behalf. Talking about this one. So this is, I love this little church. I always, don't tell them I said this, but I call them the little church that could. So, well, there's two little churches that could. This one and the next one, which are both in Vermont, in the Champlain Valley. So St. Stephen's Middlebury is right on the green in the center of Middlebury. That's where Middlebury College is, although Middlebury College is not in the town. It's kind of on the outside. It's an early Gothic revival, and if there's any church architecture nerds like me in the room, it was sort of built during the time when Hopkins was Bishop of Vermont, who was a really early proponent of Gothic architecture in the Episcopal Church. Okay, sorry for the footnote for anybody who was not interested in that one. But anyway, this was a church that's a vital congregation, and that kind of led them into some complacency about who they were and what they were doing in town. And they were not the biggest church in town. They were not the fanciest church in town. They were not the one that was on everybody's lips. But they were sort of, things were okay. Well, then disaster struck. And the disaster was a massive railroad realignment project in Vermont that's going right through the heart of the city. And the church is kind of on an escarpment, and the railroad is right here, okay? I can't tell you how freaked out they were about what this was going to do to not just their building and potentially harming it, but also their ministry. I mean, the whole idea that are people going to be able to be here on Sunday mornings? Are people going to come to our ministries and to our programs and to all the stuff that we do here in the center of town? And we said to them, well, have you talked to other people about it? And they said, well, not really. Well, they went to the businesses and the college and others, and guess what? Everybody was in the same boat. So they worked with Vermont Interfaith Network to get some facilitators together, and they actually ended up convening the community conversation around how do we make this project work for our community? How do we connect with each other to make sure that our community's quality of life and vitality is not harmed or diminished by this project? And how do we work together to make our voice loud enough to have an impact at the state level on those who are planning this project so that we can win some concessions or some mitigation that will help improve the conditions in our town and not harm all of our businesses and faith communities and lives together. And it worked. It worked for them. And they not only won some really important concessions from the state on this by convening this group of civic leaders together, but they also have become a way different kind of congregation in terms of being a partner in the city. So it's a kind of really amazing effort on their behalf. This is another wonderful congregation, St. Paul's Virgins, which is kind of halfway between Middlebury and Burlington on the west side of Vermont. They're a really amazing congregation. They did a couple of very cool things. The first thing they did was they said, if we are to grow, we need to try and support a full-time rector. We really believe having a full-time clergy on staff is actually going to support growth, which is not the choice that a lot of vestries are making in the Episcopal Church and in terms of lay leaders and other denominations as well. But they decided this is what they're going to do. Well, they did it the first year, they made it through, and then they were terrified about supporting it the next year. But they told their story to their own members about the volunteer hours that they put in every year, about the stories of people's lives who've been touched by the congregation, and about their value to the community. And they've been able to grow their stewardship every year since then and meet the challenge that they set to themselves, which was, we want to support a full-time clergy person, but we do not know how we're going to do this every year. And they've been able to do that. Well, they have done a couple of other really interesting things focused on their building. They're right on the green as well, so they've got this great downtown location in the town. And they actually just created an open house. They said, let's invite leaders from all the other civic institutions and stakeholders in our community to come inside. And we can show them how hospitable we are, what kind and generous people we are, and how willing we are to use our assets for a bigger common purpose that supports the wider community. And that's helped them go really far in terms of making some really great relationships there. And they said, look, there are a lot of community events that happen in that town green. We need to be open and we need to be present every time there's an event there. We need to show people who we are and to be there with them and beside them every time they're there, using that space and doing all the things that make this a wonderful, vital place to live. The other thing they did was they worked with the community to envision how to make their campus work better, both for themselves and their mission to serve others, because they're butting up against the issue where they need more space because they have a lot of families now, they have a lot of kids, they need new and better spaces for ministry around families and children. But they've got a kind of difficult campus with a lot of challenges, and it's on a very public location next to the town green. So they brought the community in with them through a process called asset mapping and a design charrette, which brings architects and designers together to solve physical challenges. They did that to envision what they could do better with this space and how they could come up with a plan that reflects how they want to minister internally, how they want to minister to the community, and how the community could benefit from using their space and having it available. This United Church of Morrisville is a little UCC, or United Church of Christ congregation, also in Vermont, that had a building that was going, like most are, unused during much of the week. They had written some grants to restore a historic stained glass window, and they wanted to care for their historic building. But the fire that was ignited happened when we worked with some of their members to talk about the new kind of ways that they might serve community. And they heard from people, this is a kind of a blue-collar town. It kind of upends some of the images of Vermont that we think of because there's a lot of out-of-state resources and money that go into the state. But Vermont's truly much more of a blue-collar state. And over 25% of the people in Vermont are food insecure, which means that access to food every week is tenuous sometimes. So there are a lot of hungry people there. And so this congregation decided, well, we've got a great kitchen, we've got a great historic hall next door to it, and we've got the people who care about this. So they put together an everyday breakfast program called Breakfast on Us, Monday through Friday, that was focused really on school children because the support for school breakfast is pretty weak there. That program grew so tremendously within a few short months even, that they had free flour from King Arthur's Flour, they had free backpacks to give out to kids, they had free school supplies, they had just an abundance kept growing in terms of this ministry, in terms of what they were able to do for people. Then another amazing chapter was they have this great basement. They said, we've got to make our basement usable. We're going to invest in pulling this together and making it a better space for people so that we can actually use it for programming. Well, this is a town where if you're a teenager and you're not involved in sports, there's not really a lot for you to do. And there was a teen center program, but the town had to cut the staffing for that project from its budget. So the church went to the town and said, hey, we've got space and we've got staff. Can we run the program? And they run it it's not a religious program. They don't run it as a religious teen center. They're not doing Bible studies. But but they did take over the town's teen program. It's run entirely in their space with their staff, which is kind of a pretty wonderful story in what some people report as the least church state in the country. So that means the state where people go to church the least, right? So it's just kind of another wonderful story about them. I've kind of run through a lot of different examples. I have a lot more, but those are just sort of meant to give a little bit of an overview. Some of those churches, the ones that were from Vermont, were all a part of a particular project that I worked with that was a cooperative effort between the Vermont Conference of the United Churches of Christ and the Vermont Episcopal Diocese, who we've worked with for a number of years. There is maybe one more church I would add to that mix, which was Christ Church Montpelier, which is still in early stages of it, but just a really amazing congregation. I mean, totally phenomenal group of people and an amazing priest in charge there. They looked at their parish house and realized that what they wanted to do was fill a huge need in Montpelier, which was housing for low-income people and transitional housing. And so they're actually redeveloping their parish house to be housing, to be transitional and mixed-income housing. So they're still working on that. They're in the early stages. That was like a pretty visionary effort on their behalf. So that's a lot of different examples there. And I hope it gives a sense of some range. I would love to answer more questions about any of those or take any questions that you have and hear some of your thoughts as well. Yeah, Michael.
Josh, I wonder,
We know each other. That's why I know his name.
have you ever with partners had a situation, can you think of an example where you have actually encouraged a congregation to demolish or sell some part of their building or property that was just an albatross?
No. I'll tell you why. And maybe don't tell my colleagues I said this. I think if you're, well, they would agree with some parts of what I'm about to say. If you're a congregation that really just cannot, or a parish that cannot really make it work in terms of a property, and it's not working for you, then you shouldn't have it. But demolishing it, let me put it this way. When neighborhoods are, and especially if you're in an urban environment where neighborhoods are changing very quickly, for a church which says that it's here to call all people to Christ and to serve all people, all are welcome, but we'll tear down buildings in your neighborhood and let a gas station go up, or high-end housing which continues to push out regular residents, things like that. We see that a lot. And I have to say, it does not look good on the church to make that kind of move. I think it takes a little bit more help, and this is where outside partners really are important. Too often in the church, we want to do everything on our own. We want Episcopalian consultants, we want Episcopal resources, we want Episcopal stuff because, we're the club. But really reaching out to people outside of the church is hugely important, like people who have a mind for real estate that has some social purpose, like a Ken Weinstein in Philadelphia, for instance, who's redeveloped several historic churches and worked with the churches to do that. So my view is, let me give you a long answer, is if a church really can't hold on to a property anymore, it should faithfully and with some really good guiding principles transition that and look for a new owner or a new developer who can continue to use that building for some kind of common good or purpose beyond just whatever the market is going to do. That's my advice. So we've worked with churches in Philly that have had to sell or they've just been insistent they've got to sell, and we've connected them with developers that can, not knock the thing down, basically, and do something that kind of works for people. That's kind of my answer. I don't know if that was, but that's our experience with that so far. Yeah. I was going to say, are there any churches that are looking at those kind of questions? Yeah. Right.
which means they want free space to put on
Right.
whatever.
Right.
But also everybody wants to rent space for their offices and things like that. I'm aware of another church that they have a practice of a couple times a year they just like shut the building down and it's like they call it the building Sabbath, and that's when they get all of the deferred maintenance done for that week or something. This, I feel like I'm in a little bit of a policy dispute with some of my other leaders about whether it's okay to let a room just be empty, like a Sunday school classroom that's, only used on Sundays, or whether that's okay or whether it's sort of theologically, there's some imperative for us to constantly make our space available to everything. I don't know if you have any thoughts on the larger philosophical question there that comes behind all that.
There are. I mean, if you're concerned about wear and tear, I mean, obviously, just it as a management administrative question, building that expectation into leases and into overall schemes for building management and cycles of maintenance and building stewardship. But that's a really good question. I would say anytime you're using the building, and if you're using it for purposes that align with your mission, so there's lots of people, who are going to want to use your space, and it's because they need space. And you're a church, so they also think that they can get it cheaply or for nothing. And that actually doesn't suit your purposes either, and it doesn't actually suit your purposes for ministry and mission either. There are some uses that you may want to subsidize, like, sure, let's have the Cub Scouts use this place free. But there are other uses where you say, maybe the dance troupe actually needs to pay at least the cost of carry for that space that they use and the timing that they use it. In terms of letting it lie, silent, that's people that are not in the building. And I don't know your parish, but it sounds like it's probably not in danger of a huge preservation challenge and building need, but buildings are best when people are using them. And the church, anytime you can have an excuse for people to come through the doors, is an interaction with them. And it's not even necessarily focused on whether or not they're going to become a member of your parish, but it adds to a larger sense of who you are. It's like, oh, I don't know about that place. I mean, in a time where the image of the church is pretty negative for a lot of people who are not churched, knowing that your friend dances there every week and it's a wonderful place and every member they've met has been charming to them, we hope, right? That is really important, I think. So, I mean, it's just to add into your conversations on the kind of pros and cons. Uh-huh.
But I think one of the struggles that I have in terms of discipleship is differentiating our parish from a social services organization or community center.
Yeah.
These things where, on the one hand, we're working to elevate our congregation out of that
Yeah.
and on the other hand, sort of similar to Kate, ceding some of our spaces to those endeavors. What has been your perspective from so I guess I'm 100% on board with maintaining the utility of the church or the face of the church or the exterior presence. What's been your experience working within the congregation in terms of their own development? Apart from the reduced anxiety about just building, how and whether if some of these approaches actually can encourage that kind of spiritual growth within the congregation that's looking to make the space, to keep the space truly sacred and not merely a symbol of a formerly sacred space, but now just a sacred space.
Yeah, and I think that's an interesting question because it goes back to what the congregation thinks about its purpose here. That's a conversation around sort of identity and mission, and so identity is kind of the including your past, just like you and I have memories. Like, okay, so what does that all add up to who I am, right? And what's our mission? Like, what do I do every day? Why am I doing what I do every day, right? And then vision is, at the result of, 10 years in the future of me doing what I do every day, what will the world around me look like, right? Congregations, the really important piece, and this is a part of our work, is they have to kind of look at their identity. Who are you? Who have you been? Who are you now? What are your assets? Okay, what are your strengths in terms of people, in terms of the building, in terms of whatever? What are your assets? And what are you here to do? Are you here to make uses available so that you can have Mass on Sunday morning and, your weekly healing service on Wednesdays and be comfortable and have a priest that you can call throughout the week? Like, is that what you want? If that's what you want, then, I really advocate about being completely honest with congregations. What do you want to do? Because a lot of it's like they say in the book of Joshua. Is it the book of Joshua? Today I set before you life and death. Be totally honest about it. Like, do you want to do what you're doing until you either run out of money or people? Or do you want to take some big risks and see if you can make a challenge to yourself here, a challenge that maybe God promises he can help you with, right? Work and do bigger ministry here. In the interim period, you're probably not going to be able to, not you, but one may not be able to carry the cost of a big aging facility in the middle of a great city. And so having some key partners there is important to do that. But having a long-term vision of where you want to go in terms of your ministry, a lot of churches say, well, we can't rent that room because we wouldn't be able to do this thing that we do 3 times a year in that room. It's like, look, it's never build it and they will come. It's not even in the church. It's never build it and they will come. It's never build it and they will come. Do something first, and then you'll need the space. Do something until you're busting out of the seams, and you have more people, and everybody's on top of everybody, and you say, we've got to have more space. But never, and a lot of churches do that. They're like, well, we can't because that thing that we do in October is going to be ruined if they're using that room. And it's like, right, because you do one thing in October. How about you do something so often and so frequently with so many people that you need more space? Not you have more space to fill than you can pay for, and you can't pay the bill. You're having trouble paying the bills. Every vestry meeting, everyone is biting their nails over the oil bill, the heating bill every winter. And yet, you're telling me you've got to hold on to this thing. Well, actually, you don't have to hold on to that. And so, that's the second part. What I'm saying? So the first part is, what are you here to do and where are you going with it? And that's really spiritual discernment, and that can be really tough. And there may be people there who say, look, I just want to come to church on Sunday mornings, and that's it. That's all I want to do. That's the story. I don't really care. Are we going to have enough resources to do that? And some other people that say, we're here, and God has called us to be here in this spot, right, to call other people towards him and to help other people meet Christ and his redeeming work here. And that's what we're going to do. And that's got to have, a good program behind it in terms of, a scheduled series of how do we do that? How do we build that out? I don't know if I answered your question, but... Yeah. Exactly, and just being honest with people and say, look, I'm going to give you a 2-year lease because hopefully in 2 years we may use this space. And also talking to people about what's your mission. This is who we are, okay? We're, St. Margaret's Parish, and this is what we do, and this is what we care about, and this is who we are. Who are you? And do you kind of jive and align with what we're doing or not? Because if you don't, you're not a fit for here right now. But if you are kind of complementary to what we're doing, okay, this makes sense for us. That's a really key piece. It's not just catch as catch can. It can't be that way for churches, because that's not in your DNA really. If it does become part of your DNA, that's a parish that's thinking in ways that are not going to necessarily probably bear fruit in the end. Put it that way. Anyway. Yes.
It's interesting, I got that first thing at the same issue. I'm the rector of a 20-year-old church, open space, built to look like a Pennsylvania Dutch farm. It's a gorgeous little property. We're packed. We've gotten kids out into the trailers for Sunday school. We produce this for anything but an hour. We use the plumbing. You have to walk through a muddy field to get there. So we're engaging in the process for a capital campaign. But the drumbeat my members are hearing is the rest of the church saying, your buildings are an albatross, don't add to them because you can't afford to keep them because the church is dying. And we have this clear need to expand our space because we're packed.
Hmm?
And this larger narrative of the church saying, no, it's a dying proposition to even think about doing this, that comes from very high levels of the Episcopal Church. And I'm just trying to figure out how to, appropriately recraft the narrative, because we can grow and thrive and have a spirit of abundance, but it almost feels like we're being crushed from above.
That's not a unique narrative in the Episcopal Church. I'd say every judicatory, so every governing body that I've worked with in, every mainline denomination, that's the anxiety, to be quite frank, that is driving a larger way of framing an antagonism that I consider a totally false dichotomy between physical assets and congregational ministries. If a congregational ministry has gotten to the point where it's not flourishing enough in order to support the basic stewardship and maintenance of a building, either there's a problem in terms of maybe there's some capacity issues around the leadership in terms of understanding how to take care of a building and how to manage all those issues, or it's not flourishing, that I don't want to be harsh and say, well, I do want to say though, well, grow. Seriously, that sounds like totally crazy, because a lot of people in the Episcopal Church and in other denominations are really about managing decline. So the cat's out of the bag, are really about managing decline and really about a cycle of scarcity that drives a mentality that is around, you're getting smaller, you have less money, so cut your costs wherever you can, get half-time and quarter-time clergy, sell your building, move into the parish house, do all this stuff that is like really hard in my work and in the spiritual tradition in which I am a part of, to say, Christ never really said, let's manage getting smaller. He said the whole point here is growing and getting bigger. And that's frightening, though, because for well over probably almost 2 generations now, we have this sense that we are caught in a whirlwind pattern of inevitability, and we don't question that narrative. Because you don't say, God didn't tell us that. God didn't say, I have brought you here to make you smaller and give you less resources. Right? But we say, oh gosh, nobody in the West is going to the church anymore. Everybody's irreligious all of a sudden, and there's nothing we can do about it. I wonder if there is just some compelling way that we had to bring people to God and grow congregations. I don't know. Maybe it would be called the gospel. But this idea that what we are in is both inevitable, which if you study the pattern of American history, is not true. The 1950s are basically an outlier in terms of religious adherence. Religious adherence is like this. Religious adherence is not like somehow in the mists of time, every single person believed in God and was absolutely 100% religiously adherent. That is not true at all. There have been waves of adherence and decline in both American and Western history in terms of religious faith. So it's not inevitable, and if it's inevitable, have we asked who wrote that story? Did God write that story? Or did the forces around us and the cultural institutions outside of the church write that story? And why have we bought that story? And if we've questioned that, we might then say, well, what do we do now? What do we do next? It's been sort of brought up, even Merrick sort of brought it up in some ways. We don't want to, be like, we don't want to scare people and all of this, but the truth is we need to grow. We have to grow. It's almost our command is to grow. Go out and make disciples of all nations. It's not. So I would say there are lots of ways. There's some of the things I talked about here. I think crafting that narrative for your own congregation to say this is actually a calling for us. Our calling is to do this not because we want to have a Cadillac, but because we want to use our resources to reach more people, to serve more people, to grow the kingdom of God here on earth. I mean, that's the point of it, right? So, it's funny. There are two things that are going in opposite directions in our society right now. There's hyper-localism, where everybody's like, local heritage, local identity, local places, local agriculture, local economy, relationships, networking, people to people, right at the local level. And then there's this mega bajillion dollar economy of like dematerializing where, Uber doesn't own a single car and is worth billions of dollars, right? They don't own a single car, right? For instance, right? That's the market. But I don't think we're here to take our cues from the market, right? So there's that whole view of economic life now about, why do we, like for instance, I do it all the time. I order from Postmates. Postmates doesn't own, it's for ordering food at home, right? They don't own any restaurants. They don't own any delivery cars. They don't have any employees. They have people who are working for them. The point I'm trying to make is that there's a view of economic life now that's actually not about investing in what's local. It's not about investing in real people and local relationships and local places. And then there's this other movement that is very much about that. And where is the church between those two? Sorry, I went on way too long. Yeah, no, go ahead, please. If you have to go, because I know that they're going to be coming in soonish for morning prayer anyway. So, were there any other questions anybody had? Because I know we're almost there. Any thoughts? Okay. All right. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Thanks. Thank you.